Let's talk now to Henrik Larsson, Senior Researcher, Center for Security Studies at Zurich. He joins us virtually from the Swiss city of Zurich. Thank you very much, Henrik. Good morning, and thank you for your time.
Morning.
Let's start off with what I've just finished reporting on, which is the situation in Kaliningrad. The phrase unintended consequences comes to mind because Kaliningrad, even though an enclave of Russia, is not part of this crisis, is it?
I mean, it is a territory of Russia and then subject to the sanctions that the EU has imposed. I mean, you can say the Lithuanians has just enforced the sanctions that are in place, so Russia could expect that this would happen. And it hasn't been done by Lithuania alone. It was a decision done in consultation with the EU Commission and the rest of the EU members. I frankly do not see that the Russians can be very surprised about this. And moreover, we have to remember they can supply their Kaliningrad enclave through ships. I mean, the ports are still open. So it's, of course, more complicated and more expensive. But this idea that Kaliningrad would be starved out is ludicrous.
You are in Switzerland, which for all practical purposes is largely regarded as a neutral country, and neutrality is a phrase that much of the world is now beginning to look at a bit more closely. And that brings me to the question surrounding Finland, Sweden, and then Ukraine, and the issue of joining either NATO or the European Union. How complicated do you think it makes things when a country that was previously regarded as neutral then thinks that it needs to join one or the other side in order to enhance its security? Is it really true that security is enhanced if you belong to one side as opposed to being neutral?
Well, it depends on your strategic environment. If you have an aggressive neighbor, which is the case for Finland and Sweden, I think there's a strong case for the fact that you enhance your security by joining a defense alliance, strong defense alliance led by the United States, like NATO is. So it depends on where you are in Europe. If you're in Switzerland, you're sandwiched between, you're pretty safe. I mean, you're surrounded by non-hostile countries. So in that case, there is no need to join a military alliance, even though it is true, as you say, that Switzerland is trying to look for other possibilities to cooperate with NATO and with the EU in this crisis. We have to remember that Switzerland is a neutral country, but it also is a country that is strong advocate of international law, and that means non-aggression is a no-go. So when a country like Russia aggresses without provocation a peaceful neighbor like Ukraine, it also goes against the DNA of Switzerland.
Let's look at because Switzerland has also been noted down the years for being instrumental to resolving crisis, helping to resolve crisis. In this particular instance, it does appear that is not the case. Why do you think that's so?
Because Russia has openly said, because Switzerland has joined the EU sanctions against Russia, Switzerland can no longer hope that it can host US-Russia summits or any other summits to solve the crisis. In Russia's view, Switzerland has clearly chosen the side of NATO and the EU and thus can no longer be regarded as neutral.
Let me ask you then, the role that Turkey is playing in all of this. Turkey has already hosted one round of peace talks and says it is prepared to host another, especially now that we have the food crisis as a result of all the grain and other items that are stuck in Ukrainian ports, which are blockaded by the Russians, and the Russian ports, the Russian exports rather, cannot go out because of Western sanctions. So you have some level of a global food shortage, if you like, or crisis, depending on who you speak to. How do you think the role that Turkey is playing, or indeed anyone else who is trying to broker peace, is going to work out, given the facts as they are on the ground today?
I think, unfortunately, in the past 3-4 months, all attempts to broker peace have failed. Also, Turkey, as you mentioned, has tried for its own reasons. I mean, it doesn't like that Russia takes control of the Black Sea coast to the extent that it tries to. And of course, Turkey would also like to appear as a the country that could solve the global food crisis, or what could become a global food crisis. Unfortunately, I do not see much ground for negotiation. The battle is happening on the battlefield in Ukraine.
Given that NATO itself is now warning that this crisis could be around for quite a while, some of those involved, either directly or indirectly, are beginning to make longer-term plans than they initially had for this situation. How would you read this, the situation? There were many who said that the EU itself was not planning for something this protracted. Neither were the Russians, for that matter, and neither were the Ukrainians. But that seems to be the fact on the ground now. The more protracted it becomes, as you've just pointed out, the less there is room for peace. So where do we go from here?
It is true, as you say, that the West is now preparing for a long, protracted conflict. The NATO Secretary General has said openly that this conflict can last for years. But I mean, all wars come to an end at a point. The question is, when is Ukraine tired of war, and when is Russia tired of war? I mean, it will be decided on the battlefield, and it is about attrition, it seems. It would be a war of attrition. Not much progress is being made. Ukraine is gaining some ground in the south, I saw yesterday, and Russia is trying to gain some ground in the east. But the fronts are not moving very much. It looks like First World War, if you want to make an analogy.
Given that situation, as you said, it looks like for the First World War, and that ground on and killed so many people for more than 4 years before it ended. There will be many who will be hoping that that isn't the case here. But in actual fact, do you think that some of the suggestions that were made initially about peace? I remember that veteran diplomat, former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, talked about being pragmatic about all of this, and that there might be need for concessions. Something that the NATO Secretary General, whom you just referenced, also talked about, that there might be need for both parties to now look at some concessions that wouldn't be palatable but will be necessary for peace. Is that time here?
I think so, yeah. This is how the conflict will end. There will have to be some territorial concession on Ukraine's part. But you see, you have to understand Zelensky's perspective. If he gives up territory at this point, he will not win the next election, because he will be perceived as a person who gave up, even though he had a chance of winning. I think if you take a realistic perspective, there will have to be some giving up territory. I'm not a military expert, but it's hard to see how Ukraine would take back much of the territory that Russia has taken this year and all back to 2014. So some kind of frozen conflict is a possibility, like we have in Georgia, neighboring Moldova and neighboring Georgia, where Ukraine doesn't formally recognize territory as Russian, where it is accepted that it is like that.
That looks like something that we've had cold water poured on in the past. I remember when Henry Kissinger first made the comment, everybody wanted his head. But now it seems as if, people are finally coming around to that reality. But as you pointed out, the Ukrainian leader is in a tough spot. How tough is his spot, especially because he has this support from outside of Ukraine, and those outsiders aren't offering that support in order for him to go and give up concessions?
I mean, the West is supplying Ukraine heavily with weapons. If they hadn't done so, Ukraine would be in a terrible state on the battlefield. So you can say the West, on one hand, says negotiations are up to Ukraine, but given the degree of financial and military support of Ukraine, it would be very bizarre if the West wouldn't tell Zelensky at some point, I don't know when that will happen, now you need to try to find some kind of compromise with the Russians, see what you can get out of negotiations, because our own publics in the West are also tired of war. We can supply weapons, but the sanctions are starting to bite. We have rising inflation and so on. I'm not saying that will happen over the summer probably, but looking into the fall, maybe into the winter, we could imagine these kind of things play out, where Ukraine would be told discreetly by the West, maybe it's time to see what can be negotiated with Russia.
On the situation on the ground, I just have that final question before I let you go. On the situation on the ground in Switzerland, how much of understanding, how much of sympathy, how much of support do you think can be sustained for supporting Ukraine, as the West has been doing, and as you've referenced that Switzerland is, of course, behind the West in all of this. How much support do you think is on the ground for this, if it is no matter what it takes?
I mean, there's a great deal of solidarity in Switzerland for a country that has been aggressed unprovoked, as Russia has done. So there's this aspect of like international humanitarian law that Switzerland stands for, protecting civilians and so on. And if you talk about the broader West, there is a rather strong moral imperative to help Ukraine, not to directly intervene on their behalf in a military conflict with Russia, but strong moral imperative to help them. And it also helps from a like realistic perspective that it's a European country. So if it would be Ethiopia, let's say, as an example, the solidarity would not be as big. It's a European country that officially says it wants to come closer to Europe, be part of the European Union. Now it would probably get the EU membership perspective. So there is this element, and there is a potential, I think, for a rather strong sustainment of the Ukrainian war effort, more than that would be the case elsewhere.
Indeed. Henrik Larsen, Senior Researcher, Center for Security Studies at Zurich. Thank you for your time and for your perspective this morning.
Thank you.
After the break, thousands demonstrate against the rising cost of living, with many linking the crisis to the West's Russia policies. Please stay on with us.